Thank you everybody so much for attending the talk today. It's a great pleasure to be giving this talk on behalf of myself and Levi, who've been working here at City University of Hong Kong, looking into gesture in collaborative learning, as you can see from the image there, in context of second language acquisition and classroom discourse. I'd just like to get the presentation started on a bit of a light note, hopefully. This is a scene from the IT crowd where we have a woman who's hosting a party, and she's invited her colleagues from the IT department around a bit earlier to lay down what she calls some ground rules for normal interaction between these IT technicians. And as you'll see, these include things like keeping the conversation about things that would interest everybody, staying on topic. And then as she's giving these instructions to her colleagues, we also see that nonverbal signals and turn-taking are important, and that we need to be able to read between the lines when we're in interaction with other people and accommodate to the addressee. And not only that, but the last piece of advice she gives them is to look normal. So let's begin with this. So that was honestly me just a few minutes before this presentation trying to look normal. Well, what I'm getting at with this video is a distinction that's often made in applied linguistics between linguistics and linguistic competence and interactional competence, because applied linguists recognize very early on that students can be excellent with pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar, but still lack basic skills needed to interact socially in groups, such as turn-taking, topic management, making eye contact, and gesturing and negotiating communication breakdowns. And exactly those kind of things have been called interactional competence, and they've become really important. They're deemed essential to effective English language communication in a range of academic, professional, and social settings, and they're now taught and assessed as interactional competence on high-stakes English language proficiency exams worldwide in the form of paired or group interaction activities, such as on the Hong Kong Diploma of Secondary Education, the College English Test, Spoken English Test, that is a college exam in China, and the Cambridge B2 first exam. So they're very widely tested skills and assessed on these group interaction activities. And what you're seeing on the right of the slide there is one of the most recent models of how to think about interactional competence and how it all fits together. And we'll come back to this later on towards the end of the presentation, once we've had a look at the findings from our group on gesture and collaborative discourse. So one of those interactive skills is often referred to as breakdown repair, and breakdown repair has been kind of operationalized in applied linguistics as something called language-related episodes. And there's been some gesture studies research into how students negotiate these episodes. But what we also want to show is that it's not just the vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation that gets negotiated, but often gesture and elements of the environment can be negotiated as well. So we use the term gesture-related and inscription-related episodes. And that's the previous work that led up to this project at CityU, Gesture and Collaborative Learning. And we'll show you some data that we've come across that shows that these episodes are not only multimodal, but also distributed and dynamic too, which I'm sure won't surprise many people in the audience here today. And what we'll do then after the data is come back to this model of interactional competence. I want to try and think about it more from a dynamic systems perspective, taking the model of participatory sense making that's been developed recently in the inactive approach to cognitive science, and then draw some conclusions from that. So breakdown or breakdown repair, which is one of these skills that language practitioners and language teachers and assessors have seen as crucial to the social side of using language, has been operationalized in the research of these things called language-related episodes. That's any part of a dialogue where the students talk about the language they're producing, question their language use, or correct themselves or others. And these moments where the focus of the conversation turns in onto the language being used itself are seen as critical moments in collaborative dialogue. They seem to trigger episodes of meta-talk within which students help each other to solve linguistic problems and or co-construct language or knowledge about language. So they're kind of one indication or one measure of learning. And I'll just link here briefly to Keiko's talk a few sessions back, because she was looking at emergency care interactions. And I think that when there's a communication breakdown in the classroom, we see a kind of emergency interaction take place. Although I'm not sure that the care side of this is being attended to so much in the applied linguistics research on language-related episodes. I'll just give a little bit of background to this research on these episodes. And Sydney Otter's work on American learners of Japanese showed that they tend to occur when students begin to make mistakes or struggle. Those moments spark an episode of collaborative discourse between the students where they help each other or they offer different forms of assisted performance. And there's other research showing what kinds of problems with language can arise. And these can be pronunciation related, vocabulary focused, grammar, or pragmatics. And there's a tendency in the research to look for moments when these elements are resolved. And for example, Lisa has a very well-known category system saying that we can categorize these episodes as either solved correctly, left unresolved or abandoned, or resolved incorrectly. We'll also come back to that a bit later in the talk. So I think we should have an example of one for some real data. As you can see here, you have a group of students and they're working on an activity from the textbook that requires them to read out these letters that you can see at the top, which are the answers that they've gathered. And in line 1, the student who's in the middle of the image there struggles with the pronunciation of J, and you can see that there are little degree symbols there. That means that it's a bit marked, so it's pronounced a little bit softly. And that's because it's actually a G. There is no J in the textbook, so she's pronouncing G as J. And the fellow students pick up on this, and you can see that there are 13 turns, a very highly interactive collaborative episode, where at the end, we see that she says, oh, okay, so that might be the kind of resolution point. And what's interesting is that in between you have this rich collaborative discourse where you have the student peers providing the correct form, which is G. They do that several times. And also there are a range of gestures that accompany these different supportive strategies. So let's have a look at the video here. And we're not going to go into too much analysis of it, but just pay attention on how the episode begins, the way it's negotiated with speech and gestures, and then this kind of resolution point at the end there.
That's H, D, B, F. I, A, E, J, G, J, G.
Okay, so those gestures that you saw there, like actions where the bodies are moving that represent the sounds, that's actually a K-pop dance that she's reproducing there. We've analyzed that in a bit more detail in the paper forthcoming. But tracing the letters in the air, mirroring the tracing, and then the head nod, these have all actually been studied in second language acquisition gesture studies, because there's a lot of research into how students use gesture during these episodes of collaborative dialogue. And I think one of the early catalysts to this line of research was McNeil's experimental evidence that iconic gestures visually convey aspects of the semantic meaning integral to the speaker's utterance. Because in L2 interaction, you can see how the gesture imagery provides an important basis for the speakers to negotiate meaning and establish mutual understanding. So I'm going to give the gesture studies SLA research a bit short shrift here, and I'm sorry for that, but if we just take one example, Tanya Smotrova's work of peer interactions learning English, she showed how these gestural visualizations of students' understandings of L2 meanings allow them to reach agreement on a particular meaning, identify the points of disagreement, and clarify the meaning of an item. So inspired by that kind of research, I began looking into collaborative dialogue, and I saw something that I think has been less studied in this research. And that is when the focus is not so much on the language that's being negotiated, but the gestures themselves. And I'd like to introduce a quote from Eleanor Kafari, who writes, "Why take as given that co-speech gestures are always true, helpful, or readily and successfully interpreted?" And she quite provocatively says, gestures can go wrong. Just as we have pragmatic criteria for the giving and asking of reasons, and semantic and syntactic criteria for the production of grammatical sentences, which has been well studied, our gestural behavior finds its intelligibility by conforming to certain collectively held standards on multiple levels. So one way to show this is to just expand Swain and Lapkin's definition of language-related episodes to include gesture-related episodes, which would be any part of a dialogue where the students talk and communicate about the gesture they're producing, question their gesture use, correct their gestures, struggle with gestures. We can have a look at what that would look like in interaction and what that might teach us about the nature of gestures. I mean, gestures are obviously gestures are probably more complicated than we can ever understand, but looking at them from this perspective does show other aspects. So here's the example that's published in this paper here, which was research conducted with Svenja Adolfs, Meg Dowens, Duping, and Jeanette Littlemore in 2018. Here we have a group of students which mixes international student on the right from America and 3 local students on the left. This is at a British university campus in China. And the international student has asked them about the local geography. He said, "Where is Anhui?" And Anhui is a province that's just to the northeast of Zhejiang, which is the province that they're in. And the student's response to this is to elaborate a diagram of Chinese geography on the table in front of them. And in the paper, we show how this goes through several reiterations of strategies to display Chinese geography, which are more or less successful. And so, for example, you can see she draws out the different cities and the province and draws a circle around them saying this is the China. And what happens is there's kind of a communication breakdown where they all burst out laughing and the student pulls back from the table like that, and then they set about it again. And here we see a specific attention to the way she's gesturing, and students even proposing ways that she could gesture differently. So in one, you can see there that the student to the left leans over to where she's been drawing this diagram and says, "Maybe you should," like this, and performs a kind of rotating gesture. Then the student, the international student in front of her moves the microphone out of the way, creating a larger space for the diagram in the middle of the table. And just after that, the student to her right points to a space there and says, "Maybe you should," but it's inaudible what she actually says, but she seems to be pointing, suggesting a new location where she could begin. And at that point, the student who was originally drawing takes over, comes back in and redoes the diagram from the perspective of the international student. So let's have a look at that one. Sorry. Okay, so there you'll see she's just drawing, this is the China, and now you see these different moves from the other students who lean in and try to help. Okay, I'll show that one more time. So what are those collectively held standards to which gestures must conform? I want to be clear that the problem is not that her gesture diagram doesn't conform to some prior design of a perfect map of China, but we could here bring in a bit of work by Jürgen Streeck, who says that depiction is always a matter of convention, citing that movements with an extended finger are often meant to be seen as lines. So that would be one level. But another level is that those lines need to be made accessible to the intended beneficiary. They must exhibit recipient design. Now, previous studies of collaborative reasoning and dialogue have shown how speakers naturally take their addressee's viewpoint into account during gestural depictions. But in this example, it seems to be a lack of conformity to that expectation that led the students into a breakdown. And we explain that in the paper by saying, well, on the one hand, you have the student who possibly has never tried to explain Chinese geography in English before using a gestural diagram. And so she seems to have become absorbed by the task of production, you could say. Whereas on the other hand, you have maybe the international student's knowledge of Chinese geography that is perhaps insufficient for him to be able to see those lines as the different provinces and regions and so on. So just to draw on some work I want to bring in a bit later, the breakdown emerges as a kind of tension, or it could be seen as emerging from a tension between the individual's intention to communicate a comprehensive map to do the best that she can with that, and the requirements of the group interaction that are things like, well, you need to do the diagram from the addressee's perspective if you wish for them to understand it. So that brings us to moments where, in fact, I remember showing this data, first of all, to Tanya Smotrova, and she gave really helpful feedback on the paper originally. And she said, one of the things that's amazing about that clip is that the students are behaving as if there is a real diagram on the table. It doesn't seem any different to if there was actually one. And we can see that in this, in the next examples, which are of what Levi has called inscription-related episodes. And what he means by inscriptions is the drawings, markings, diagrams, figures, graphs, and other visual representations that may be created with, for example, pen and paper, but also chalk and blackboards, for example, during sequences like this of negotiation and explanation. And just with another trick of terminology, inscription-related episodes would be those moments when people question implicitly or explicitly correct or otherwise communicate aspects of these inscriptions that they're using to negotiate meaning. So here we have an example of that, where the students are describing to each, well, one of the students has been tasked with describing the life cycle of plants. And as you can see, we have a similar structure to the LREs and the GREs, where you have a hesitation marker that's followed by suggestions of what to do, in this case, ways to draw. Namely, he suggests drawing the whole flower. And then the student, there's uptake because she seems to follow his advice. And he continues scaffolding, you might say, by requesting for clarification. And then there's like this resolution sequence at the end. And what you'll see is that gesture plays an important role here in the inscription as well, as gesture allows the student to indicate which parts of the diagram his feedback refers to.
I think you can draw a flower.
Just like that.
And if at the bottom one, so which had been okay.
Yes.
Okay, I'll just show that one more time. It's probably a bit quick.
You can draw a flower.
Just like that.
And if at the bottom one, so which had been okay.
Yes.
Okay. So like linguistic items, pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar, and the gestures we've seen, these inscriptions or drawings become very much a part of the episode. And they're also talked about, questioned, and co-constructed. How the students act interact with the inscriptions, or rather how they interact while inscribing, discloses their interpretation, or what Streeck might say their analysis, of the inscription's meaning, as they both work to a shared understanding. And that shared understanding, as it's developing, changes the environment in which they're interacting. And that those changes in the environment, for example, by modifying the diagram, pointing to it, which elaborates the meaning in it, then reflexively come to influence the interaction patterns, for example, not least by playing a pivotal role, quite literally in orchestrating the embodied speech and gestures, which means that the way Levi puts this is that, well, the diagrams begin coordinating the speech and gesture. So we can see that as a kind of orchestration of the speech, the gestures, and the diagrams, which are different material resources, but they're all intertwining here and elaborating each other. So once we've looked at LREs and GREs and IREs and thinking, well, what might be next? I think we need to come back to the notion of actually separating these as analytical units, so to speak, because it seems that what the students are negotiating in these communication breakdowns, vocabulary, pronunciation, grammar, but also gesture and embodied relations with the environment, is not something separate from how they are negotiating an interaction, which is by using vocabulary, pronunciation, grammar, gesture, and embodied relations with the environment. So that kind of questions this notion of distinction between linguistic competence and interactional competence. And maybe we begin to recognize that there's a notion of language proper that has become disembodied and void of interaction. And at the same time, we also see these distinctions between non-verbal and verbal behavior beginning to be very problematic, where we recognize now a view of embodied behavior that seems to have been disenlanguaged. And if you look back to McNeil's paper in 1985, he already begins to question these distinctions between verbal and non-verbal behavior, and yet we still find them in lots of different strands of research where they can play a useful role as an analytical tool. But when we see them, the way that these different, let's say, material resources, including the bodies, the environment, and different elements, begin to mutually elaborate and intertwine with each other, distinctions like this become more problematic. So Levi prefers to talk about communication-related episodes. But I think that we could maybe tie in with other strands of gesture studies research and maybe speak about languaging-related episodes, and even ask, well, if the distinction between linguistic competence and interactional competence is beginning to merge away, then what are these languaging episodes related to? So we could maybe speak about relational languaging episodes, and that's something that we propose in the paper with David Fleming and Yuhua Chen. And it's from that perspective that we can now introduce the current project of gesturing collaborative learning and language-related episodes, to go back to that term, and look at another situation of communication breakdown repair. So the aims of the current project: to better understand the role of gesture and embodied interaction in group collaborative learning, and to conduct quantitative and qualitative analysis of communication breakdowns in a multimodal corpus. The goal being to explore implications of a multimodal world-involving view of interactional competence, as we've seen, for teaching and assessment. The data that we're using comes from the multimodal corpus of academic written and spoken English, or MUCORS, and the meta paper there, written by Mike Stevens and Yuhua Chen and myself, will be available very soon. We've just submitted the proofs for that, so it should be coming out. And you'll read in that paper that the multimodal corpus there has approximately 24 hours of naturally occurring paired and group interaction in the English for academic purposes and specific purposes, pre-sessional and preliminary year classes at a British University campus in China. And we operationalize learning as the negotiation of these language-related episodes, which, as you've already seen, according to Williams, will provide a range of discourse moves, including requests for assistance, negotiation sequences, feedback, and so on. And initially, we began to identify and categorize the language-related episodes following the well-known criteria in the literature, such as the beginning of the episode as one of the students making a mistake or struggling that leads to this discourse, and then the end of the episode being the first indication that it's been resolved. And we there began with Lisa's categories of resolved accurately, unresolved or abandoned, or resolved incorrectly. And in doing that, Levi identified 70 instances of this in part of the multimodal corpus. The problem is that when we started looking at the first example of breakdown repair and tried to categorize the ending as solved or unresolved or resolved incorrectly, we immediately ran into some problems. But these problems, which we'll talk about in a minute, these problems don't seem to have been causing problems in other research, because even in this paper by Fernandez Dubao in 2020, LREs were successfully classified according to their outcome as successfully or unsuccessfully resolved. And for example, her results are presented in this way, where you have very clear types of LREs, lexically focused or grammatically focused, and the resolution is resolutely successful or unsuccessful, successful, unsuccessful. And on that basis, she can claim, for example, that certain learners are as likely to resolve their LREs as other kinds of learners. So they've been making headway with that kind of research there, but we encountered problems with this successful, unsuccessful distinction immediately. And here comes the last example of negotiated discourse, which really questions this, I think really raises problems for A, the distinction between interactional competence and linguistic competence on the one hand, and B, the classifications of these LREs into resolutions in a very categorical way. So in this example, you'll see students, with all due respect, I'm calling them black and red here because of the colors of their clothes. That will make them easier to follow through this transcript, which is quite messy. And I do apologize in advance to anybody who is more oriented toward conversational analytical research. You'll find yourself very frustrated in the way I'm presenting these speeches in terms of the bubbles I'm using, but it's just a way of presenting them here, hopefully. So here we have the student who begins to struggle, and actually she's looking, so they've been asked to design a control system. They've been asked to design a control system, and they immediately run into a problem looking for a word, and that word is infrared. So here she struggles, and her peer leans over the table and asks the group that sat opposite them for the word using Chinese. So she says, Hong Wai Xian, like that twice. Gray is looking in his textbook and retrieves the term and gives it to her infrared. In chorus with the student White, who sat next to Gray, sounds funny, sorry, they repeat the term successfully, and then the original student Black takes this up into her next sentence of the task and uses it seemingly without any problem. Use infrared to detect people approaching the door. Let's have a look.
For example, what is the first step? That one comes to an argument or is the base is our right to measure the level of the water.
Okay, so you saw the word search, the struggling, the word search, asking the peer over the table using Chinese, receiving the term, using it in chorus, okay, and then the student picking it up and running with it without any problems, seemingly. So we might say resolved. However, there's now a stretch of interaction where a different aspect of this term creates some problems. Not its pronunciation or its translation into English, but the way it's written. Because as Black now says, use infrared to detect people approaching the door. Red says yes. Okay, so how to write it? And this is another aspect of the word infrared. Her peer mistakenly thinks she's talking about data capture. No, infrared. So she now knows how to use the term okay, but she doesn't know how to spell it. So now Red goes back over the table to ask Gray how to spell it. They need to get his attention. He says, oh, hey. And then she asks how to spell infrared. And he provides the form in typing voice, I think it's called INFRA. Interestingly, just the beginning part. The peer next to White picks up on this and also repeats it while the original student Black is carrying on with her sentence and seems to have picked this up okay and writing it down. Actually, she's writing it down at this point. And her friend says yes, and then she carries on. So let's have a look at this point, this bit. And again, just pay attention how they now search for the spelling of this word, not its pronunciation. And again, go back over the table to do that. Okay, so there they got the spelling of the term from across the table and wrote it down in a handbook and in the text and on the kind of sketch paper they're using. And in the background, you can hear the teacher now saying, okay, guys, 1 minute, kind of wrap it up. They now move into another stage of the interaction where he's asked them to describe their system that they designed to other groups. These students don't do that. They just describe it to each other and kind of still try to figure out the way they're talking about it. And you do feel the pace of this conversation is now picked up because it's definitely a more, they've gone past the sketching stage. They come into this discussion phase. There again, you see the student in Black who can use this term seemingly okay. There must be infrared detector, like inside the door, detecting if people leave. But then when it comes to Red wanting to use it, she says she has a different view on this kind of system they're developing and says, but when people walk through the doors, the in begins to struggle. In the next sentence, I think we'll get the infrared, manages to find the word after a while, but I want you to pay attention to how she gets that word, because as you can see in the image there, she points to the sketchbook that they've been developing this system on. Once she says that, then her friend comes back and disagrees. No, like why? People walk through the door. So let's have a look at this. It's a bit more high-paced interaction than the one we saw previously.
So there must be infrared detector like inside the door detecting staff rolling staff people left at work the door can be closed. So when people walk through the door, the inside and the outside sensors, I think will get the infrared still get the signal.
Okay, I just want to play that one more time. And again, just focus on the pace of this interaction as it's more of a discussion. They're disagreeing with each other. And you have the student in Black who seems to be able to use this term infrared quite well, whereas the student on the right in red struggles a little bit when it comes to use that term and now points back to this resource they have on the table, which was initially where they wrote the word down. And that is what allows her to complete her sentence. But then the student in Black comes back with another disagreement and a question and then carries on. So we'll just watch that one more time.
So there must be infrared detector like inside the door detecting staff rolling staff people left at work the door can be closed. So when people walk through the door, the inside and the outside sensors, I think will
Okay. We'll come back to discussing this example a little later, but I just want to conclude this part on those IREs, GREs, and this additional episode that we see here. So by attending to the embodied and environmental embeddedness of students' language use and breakdown repairs, we find that the outcomes of these breakdowns may occur at different times and levels for various members in the group whose roles in the group interaction were also more or less central and who introduced different resources to the interaction, including Chinese, joint speech, the course textbook, and notes made during the discussion on that sketch pad. So just to focus on two of the students who I was calling red and black. The student wearing black was able to pronounce the term but not spell it, though can use it in a sentence grammatically, and when needed in a debate, seems to use it rather effortlessly. Red, on the other hand, knows the word in Chinese. She's able to repeat the English term in chorus, but struggles to say it on her own and needs assistance from notes to use it in a debate. And that seems to be what undermines the persuasiveness of her talk as she is giving her response to the student, to her peer. So I don't think this conclusion will be surprising to many of the audience here, but it indicates that the outcome or the resolution of these episodes of breakdown is not always or even ever categorical, successful, unsuccessful, but it's distributed among the different members in the group who understand the item differently at different points and through different ways. And it's dynamic. That is that, well, first of all, we saw that maybe the phonological form was what was being negotiated, but then it was the orthographic form, how to spell it. And then it was how to use this in a sentence. And then, well, how to use this as part of a sentence that I'm using to try and make a point in this argument. And I think that's also how we see a distinction, not between linguistic competence and interactional competence, but maybe between the individual's ability and the individual's role in the interaction and patterns of the interaction themselves that come to influence those individual abilities inside of the within the interaction or interwoven in the interaction. And another thing that we see, I think it's relevant here to refer to social anthropologist Tim Ingold, who reminds us that no matter how much we build our scientific theories and our categories and the way we present these, the creeping entanglements of life will always and inevitably triumph over our attempts to box them in. And I think that that is what Levi and I encountered when we looked at our first episode of a correctly resolved LRE and had to go back into the data, find other camera angles, extend the sequence that we were looking at to see actually that this was distributed and dynamic way beyond the original analytical unit that we had taken. So if you're just joining this presentation now, we've been looking at most generally, I think, the notion of social skills and which is considered as interactional competence in applied linguistics, and often one of the items of interactional competence or one of those skills is communication breakdown, and that has been operationalized as language-related episodes. We've had a look at the role of gesture in negotiating these problems and seen that gesture itself can't be taken as a given, as Eleanor Kafari would say. But not only are these language-related episodes of negotiating very multimodal, but they're also distributed and dynamic. And these findings fit with a number of frameworks for cognition and interaction, some of which we've already seen in the seminar series, such as the dynamic variably polysemiotic system by Alan Chenke, dynamic systems theory applied to second language acquisition and development, languaging. I mentioned Tim Ingold and his ontology of knotting or the meshwork. and inactive cognitive science, or the inactive approach, and their notion of participatory sense making. And I'd just like to spend the last few minutes of my talk trying to show what that might help us, how that might help us improve our understanding or give us a different understanding of interactional competence. And to do that, I'll come back to this tree. Since the weather's nice today, lots of trees outside. Do they all look like this one? This Galaxy and Taylor developed on the basis of what they report as a comprehensive definition of interactional competence, drawing upon recent theoretical and empirical work to date, and that's published in 2018. And the paper does cover a lot of work in interactional competence. The way they describe this model is you have the main trunk of the tree that represents the interlocutors, who are co-located as a pair or a group within a shared time and space, regardless of whether they're interacting in face-to-face or online. Their respective interactional skills of topic management, turn management, breakdown repair, interactive listening, and nonverbal behavior are shown as large limbs of the tree, from which emanate smaller branches representing micro features of each skill. So for example, topic management encompasses initiating, extended, shifting, and closing down topics. And you can see the way that they root or ground their tree in different levels of the speech situation, like the speech act on the one hand, and the speech event, which might be something like a word search task or an explanation activity, and then the speech situation, the macro context of maybe the classroom and the L2 interaction. But I was inspired to think about this by actually wandering around Taipo and where I live in Hong Kong, and having a look at some real trees and thinking how very unlike they were actually. And as you can see in these pictures of trees near where I live, they're often together and they have these roots running everywhere that are quite interesting and get entangled with each other, and you don't know which root is coming from where. And this kind of image here of the real trees is actually being modeled as, there's a model of social interaction and cognition and language use that looks more like these trees that we see here rather than the tree that's been taken in the models of interactional competence. So it looks something like this, and this is a model of participatory sense making that's been developed in embodied cognitive science. So with roots in phenomenology and philosophical biology, enaction theory takes the self-organization of living beings, which you can see here represented in the arrow that is consuming itself while integrating and rejecting elements from its local environment, as the foundation for human cognition and for all meaning or sense making. And what these enactivists and the proponents of enactive theory have done is demonstrated how that model, grounded within a framework of self-organizing biological and sensory motor life, can be expanded to encompass language and social interaction. And the way that this model is explained is, well, when two or more autonomous systems adapt to each other as part of regulating their relations to the environment, that's the environment in which their encounter is taking place. The interaction itself takes on a similar self-organizing pattern of adaptive behaviors. And this relational dynamics has consequences for an approach to embodied interaction, because we see a level of analysis not reducible in general to individual behaviors, different branches of the interactional competence tree, or even to individuals as ready-made interactors. And we can just look back at this episode, before concluding there, where we see how the interaction kind of changes gears, and we see how it puts these additional, it creates a different environment for the peer dialogue to take place. And we see that it places new constraints on the use of this new word that they've used, and also introduces a new environment for them to use to help negotiate the interaction. So now, for example, the sketchbook where they initially drew their system and that they had written down the word infrared is no longer a sketchbook, but now it becomes a resource that they can refer to help them, a kind of like extended memory for them to retrieve this term. So De Paulo and colleagues in a book, Linguistic Bodies, write, from the perspective of an individual agent, basic participatory sense-making could be experienced as no more than a special sort of engagement with the world, one where the agent's regulations are contingently thwarted, extended, challenged, or simply challenged by the interaction dynamics following certain enduring patterns. And I think that's what we see here, because the patterns of the interaction are what are influencing whether or not the word is being used and to what extent it is being used, and what is needed from the environment for that word, in this case, infrared, to be used. I realize that that's I'm not going into as much depth as I'd like there, and maybe as I'm able, but I will try to do so in the paper that we'll write up about this. So in the project, we're aiming for an approach that conceptually presupposes the relations that I've been showing today, rather than one that aims to establish or to illustrate the connections that would be ontologically prior to their identification and categorization. And that would be unpacked by reading into Ingold's Being Alive and Streak's Self-Making Man. That's 2017, actually. So back to Eleanor Kafari, who says that our uses of language regularly go beyond giving and asking for reasons, or any other branch of the interactional competence tree. Linguistic activity, verbal and non-verbal, is a medium of intentional world relation. So that is what we're seeing in these episodes. So it's like the students are not using interactional competence to negotiate linguistic competence, they're always negotiating language. And knowing language is to be negotiating language within an active approach. And negotiating language would always never be finished. And I think that's why we find problems in our data with categorization systems like correctly resolved or incorrectly resolved. Thank you very much, everybody.